My name is Jessica Warner, and I was 12 years old when I discovered the unwritten family rule. My pain didn't matter, but my younger brother's discomfort was always an emergency. I had been fighting a fever of 102 degrees for 2 days, quietly managing chills and body aches while still completing homework and household chores. Meanwhile, my brother Michael had woken up with a slight cough, and within hours, my mother had canceled her important work presentation to rush him to the pediatrician. "Stop being so dramatic, Jessica," my father said, when he found me curled up on my bed that evening, finally giving in to the exhaustion and pain I'd been fighting. "It's just a cold. Michael has actual breathing issues. You know his health is more fragile." Today, 15 years later, I stand in the doorway of my childhood home, watching my parents frantically pack an overnight bag for my 30-year-old brother, who has just called complaining of a headache after a night of drinking with friends. Meanwhile, 3 months ago, when I was hospitalized for emergency surgery after ignoring appendicitis symptoms for days because I'd been conditioned to believe my pain was never serious, they waited until the procedure was over before making the 2-hour drive to see me. They stayed for exactly 45 minutes, explaining they couldn't miss Michael's community theater performance that evening. Before I tell you how this lifelong pattern of medical double standards finally erupted into a confrontation that changed our family dynamic forever, drop a like and subscribe to hear how a woman raised to minimize her own suffering finally forced her family to acknowledge a destructive pattern that had placed her health at risk for decades. Growing up in the Warner household in suburban Cleveland meant living with a carefully maintained family mythology. Michael was the delicate, sensitive child whose health required constant vigilance, while I was the sturdy, resilient one who could handle anything without complaint. This narrative wasn't established all at once, but evolved gradually from his birth 3 years after mine, solidifying into unquestioned family truth by the time we reached elementary school. The roots of this dynamic were planted in legitimate medical concerns during Michael's infancy. He had been born 6 weeks premature, with some initial respiratory challenges, requiring a brief stay in the NICU before coming home. Though these issues resolved within his first year, the experience had deeply affected my parents, particularly my mother, who developed an intense vigilance around his health that never fully subsided, even as he grew into a generally healthy child. "We almost lost him," was a phrase I heard repeatedly throughout my childhood, usually as explanation for why my mother was calling the doctor about Michael's minor sniffle, or why my father was rushing home from work because Michael felt a little warm. This experience, the legitimate fear of losing their son in those early weeks, seemed to permanently alter how they perceived and responded to any health concern where he was concerned. My own medical history provided a stark contrast that reinforced our assigned family roles. I had been a full-term, 9-pound baby with no significant health issues. I rarely got sick during early childhood, and when I did, I tended to recover quickly without complications. This objectively positive medical history became, paradoxically, the foundation for a family dynamic that would eventually put my health at risk, because if I rarely got sick, then any illness I did experience was automatically viewed with skepticism rather than concern. "You're fine, Jessica," became the reflexive response to any health complaint I raised, delivered with a dismissive tone that discouraged further discussion. "You know you never get sick. It's probably just allergies, stress, not enough sleep." This differential treatment extended beyond immediate responses to health concerns. Michael's medical care was proactive and comprehensive. Regular checkups, prompt attention to symptoms, specialized evaluations at the slightest indication of potential issues. My medical care, by contrast, was minimal and reactive. Basic pediatric visits when absolutely required, dental appointments only when school forms demanded them, and a general expectation that anything short of a visible bone protrusion or uncontrolled bleeding didn't merit medical attention. By the time I reached middle school, I had internalized this disparity so completely that I rarely mentioned feeling unwell at all. I learned to manage fevers with over-the-counter medications stolen from the medicine cabinet, to wrap my own sprained ankles with supplies from the school nurse, and to ignore persistent symptoms until they either resolved or became impossible to conceal. This wasn't conscious rebellion, but adaptation to a family system that had made clear where medical attention and sympathy were allocated. The contrast in how our pain was perceived and addressed became increasingly evident as we moved through adolescence. When Michael complained of headaches during his freshman year of high school, My parents immediately scheduled comprehensive neurological evaluations that eventually diagnosed ordinary tension headaches, easily managed with over-the-counter pain relievers. When I experienced debilitating menstrual cramps that regularly caused me to vomit and miss school, I was told to toughen up, and that all women deal with this. It's just part of life. "Stop being so dramatic," my mother said, when she found me crying in the bathroom during a particularly painful episode. "Take some ibuprofen and get ready for school. You can't miss your math test for normal period pain." This wasn't simple negligence or cruelty. My parents loved me and provided well in many other aspects of my upbringing. The disparity existed within a complex family dynamic, where Michael's health had become a central organizing principle, while mine was peripheral at best. Medical attention and sympathy were finite resources in our household, and the distribution pattern had been established so early and reinforced so consistently that none of us, including me, questioned it explicitly until much later. The impact of this differential treatment extended far beyond momentary discomfort or frustration. It shaped how I understood my own body, pain, and worthiness of care in ways that would affect my health behaviors well into adulthood. I learned to doubt my own physical experiences, to minimize symptoms even to myself, and to push through pain that should have served as a warning signal. Most dangerously, I developed a deep-seated belief that seeking help for physical suffering was somehow selfish or unnecessary, at least when the suffering was mine. This pattern reached its most dangerous expression during my sophomore year of college, when what began as a mild sore throat evolved into a severe case of mononucleosis and strep infection that I ignored for nearly 2 weeks. By the time my roommate insisted on taking me to the campus health center, I had developed a secondary infection and was severely dehydrated. The doctor who examined me was alarmed not just by my physical condition, but by my casual attitude toward symptoms that had clearly been debilitating for days. "Why didn't you come in sooner?" she asked while inserting an IV for fluids and antibiotics. "Based on what you're describing, you've been seriously ill for at least 10 days. I shrugged, an automatic response that caused shooting pain through my swollen lymph nodes. I thought it would get better on its own. It didn't seem that bad. "Not that bad?" she repeated incredulously, pointing to my chart. "Your throat is so swollen you can barely swallow. You have a fever of 103.2, and your white blood cell count indicates a significant infection. This is precisely when you should seek medical attention." What I couldn't explain to this concerned physician was that my threshold for bad enough to seek help had been calibrated in a family where my brother received medical attention for a mild cough, while I was expected to maintain normal functioning with a high fever. The campus doctor's genuine concern for my condition was so unfamiliar that it felt almost uncomfortable, as if I were receiving care I hadn't earned or deserved. When my parents were notified about my hospitalization, against my wishes but per university policy, their response reinforced the established family pattern. My father called briefly, reminding me to keep up with my assignments so I wouldn't fall behind in classes. My mother expressed concern but quickly pivoted to telling me that Michael had been experiencing some fatigue lately, that they were watching closely, implicitly comparing our situations in a way that minimized mine. Neither parent offered to make the 3-hour drive to visit me in the campus hospital, where I ultimately spent 4 nights receiving intravenous antibiotics and fluids. In contrast, just 2 months later, they both took personal days from work to drive to Michael's university when he developed an eye infection that required routine antibiotic drops. This period, my hospitalization and their response, marked the first time I began consciously questioning the family dynamic around health and medical attention. The stark contrast between the doctor's insistence that my condition warranted serious intervention and my parents' minimal response highlighted a disparity I had previously accepted without examination. Something was fundamentally unbalanced in how illness was perceived and addressed in my family, and for the first time, I could see it clearly from outside the system that had normalized it. This awakening continued gradually throughout my college years and early adulthood, often triggered by interactions with roommates, friends, and eventually partners who expressed concern about health issues I had been conditioned to ignore. The first time a boyfriend insisted on taking me to urgent care for a severe migraine, I felt simultaneously grateful for his concern and guilty for making a fuss over something I would typically have managed alone in a dark room. When he expressed shock at my reluctance to seek treatment for debilitating pain, I began to recognize how abnormal my approach to my own health had become. "Most people go to the doctor when they're in that much pain," he said afterward, genuinely confused by my resistance. That's literally what medical care is for. These external perspectives slowly helped me recalibrate my understanding of appropriate health-seeking behavior, though the deeply ingrained patterns proved difficult to change completely. I began taking incremental steps toward better self-advocacy, establishing a relationship with a primary care physician, seeking timely treatment for infections rather than waiting until they became severe, and gradually learning to trust my own assessment of my physical symptoms, rather than automatically minimizing them. However, interactions with my family continued to reinforce the original dynamic, particularly during holiday visits or family gatherings where the contrast between how Michael's and my health concerns were addressed remained stark and consistent. At 25, I was still being told to stop complaining about legitimate health issues while watching my parents mobilize significant resources for my brother's minor ailments. The most dramatic example of this persistent pattern occurred 3 years ago, when I experienced severe abdominal pain while visiting my parents during the Christmas holiday. For nearly 2 days, I managed increasingly intense pain privately, taking over-the-counter medications and using heating pads while participating in family activities as normally as possible. When the pain finally became unbearable, I reluctantly mentioned it to my mother, who responded with familiar dismissiveness. "You probably just ate too many rich foods," she suggested, barely looking up from the holiday decorations she was arranging. "Drink some peppermint tea and try to walk it off." By that evening, I was vomiting from pain and running a low-grade fever, symptoms I reported to both parents during dinner preparations. My father offered me some antacids from the medicine cabinet. My mother suggested I lie down until dinner was ready. Neither proposed seeking medical attention despite symptoms that had been progressively worsening for nearly 48 hours. The stark contrast came later that same evening, when Michael mentioned experiencing some weird indigestion after dinner. Within 15 minutes, my mother was on the phone with their family doctor's after-hours line, describing his symptoms in detail and asking whether they should take him to the emergency room. My father was already retrieving car keys and checking their insurance information, preparation for the medical visit that both assumed would follow. "We're going to take Michael to the ER to get checked out," my mother informed me as they prepared to leave. "There's leftovers in the fridge if you get hungry later. Try to get some rest. I'm sure you'll feel better in the morning." The irony of this situation, being left alone with what would later be diagnosed as appendicitis, while my brother received emergency evaluation for indigestion, represented the pattern of differential treatment in its most extreme form. By the time my parents returned home 3 hours later, with Michael diagnosed with mild acid reflux and prescribed over-the-counter antacids, my condition had deteriorated to the point where even I could no longer deny the need for medical intervention. "I think I need to go to the hospital," I admitted when they checked on me after returning, the pain now so severe I could barely speak. "Something is really wrong." Even then, there was hesitation, my mother suggesting we wait until morning to see if I improved, my father questioning whether the emergency room was really necessary, given how busy they tended to be during holiday periods. It was ultimately Michael who insisted on taking me immediately, recognizing in my uncharacteristic request for help a level of severity that our parents still seemed unable to acknowledge. The emergency room doctor diagnosed acute appendicitis requiring immediate surgery, expressing concern about the apparent duration of symptoms and the risk of rupture. As I was being prepared for the procedure, a nurse asked about the timeline of my pain, visibly troubled by my matter-of-fact description of managing severe symptoms for days before seeking help. "Why did you wait so long?" she asked while checking my vital signs. "This could have been extremely dangerous if your appendix had ruptured." I had no simple answer for her. No way to briefly explain a lifetime of conditioning that had taught me my pain was never urgent enough to warrant prompt medical attention. Instead, I mumbled something about not realizing how serious it was, a response that was both true and profoundly incomplete. My parents arrived at the hospital shortly before I was taken to surgery, having dropped Michael at home first to rest after his own medical visit. Their concern seemed genuine but tempered with an implicit skepticism that had characterized their response to my health issues throughout my life, as if even with a confirmed diagnosis requiring emergency surgery, they weren't entirely convinced of the severity of my condition. "The doctor says this is actually quite common," my mother commented while waiting with me. Apparently, lots of people mistake appendicitis for indigestion at first. The statement seemed designed to normalize my delayed care-seeking, rather than acknowledging the family dynamic that had contributed to it. After surgery, my parents visited briefly, explaining they needed to get back home because Michael was still not feeling well after his emergency room visit for acid reflux. They promised to return the following day, but ultimately called instead, explaining that between holiday preparations and checking on Michael, an in-person visit wouldn't be possible. I was discharged to my apartment alone, arranging for a friend to drive me home and help with basic needs during the initial recovery period. This experience, the appendicitis episode, and the stark contrast in how our simultaneous health concerns were addressed, became a crystallizing moment in my understanding of our family's medical double standard, the pattern that had been gradually becoming visible to me through external perspectives, and incremental awareness was now undeniable in its clarity and potential danger. I had nearly experienced a life-threatening medical emergency because I had internalized the family belief that my pain didn't warrant the same attention or urgency as my brother's. In the months following this incident, I began working with a therapist to address not just the medical self-neglect I had normalized, but the deeper patterns of self-worth and family dynamics that had enabled it. Through these sessions, I came to understand that the issue wasn't simply about medical attention, but about a fundamental imbalance in how care and concern were distributed in our family system, an imbalance that had shaped my relationship not just with my health, but with my sense of deserving care in all aspects of life. You learned early that your brother's needs would always take precedence over yours, my therapist observed during one particularly insightful session. So you adapted by becoming the child who didn't have needs, or at least didn't express them. That adaptation helped you function within your family system, but it's created patterns that are now putting your health at risk. This framework helped me understand that my parents' differential treatment wasn't necessarily conscious or malicious, but emerged from complex family dynamics that had become self-reinforcing over decades. Michael's early health challenges had created a hypervigilance that persisted long after the original concerns were resolved, while my early resilience had been transformed from a positive trait into justification for medical neglect. Understanding these patterns intellectually was an important step, but changing my own health behaviors and addressing the family dynamic directly proved far more challenging. I made significant progress in my personal approach to medical self-care, establishing regular checkups, seeking timely treatment for health concerns, and gradually learning to trust my own assessment of my physical needs. However, interactions with my family continued to trigger the old patterns of minimization and self-doubt, particularly when faced with their unchanged responses to health issues. The confrontation that would finally disrupt this entrenched family dynamic occurred 3 months ago, triggered by a situation that so perfectly exemplified our differential treatment that it seemed almost deliberately designed to highlight the disparity. I had traveled to my hometown for my father's 60th birthday celebration, a weekend gathering that included extended family and longtime family friends. The Friday evening before the main celebration, I began experiencing symptoms of what would later be diagnosed as a severe kidney infection, back pain, fever, and increasing discomfort that I initially attempted to manage privately. By Saturday morning, my symptoms had worsened significantly, with a high fever and pain severe enough to make normal movement difficult. When I finally admitted to my mother that I was feeling extremely unwell, her response followed the familiar pattern of dismissal and minimization. "It's probably just from sleeping in your old bed," she suggested, focused on preparations for the evening's party. "Take some Tylenol and try to help with the decorations. We have 30 people coming in a few hours." I made it through most of the day's preparations before the fever and pain became so severe that I retreated to my childhood bedroom, finally acknowledging to myself that I needed medical attention regardless of the family event. When I emerged to inform my parents that I needed to go to urgent care, the response was predictably resistant. "Today, right before the party?" my father questioned, his tone conveying clear disapproval. "Can it wait until tomorrow? Everyone will be here soon. I have a fever of 103 and pain in my kidney area," I explained, trying to maintain composure despite feeling physically terrible. "I think it might be a kidney infection, which can get dangerous if not treated." After some reluctant discussion, my mother agreed to drop me at an urgent care facility on her way to pick up the catering order, making it clear that she couldn't wait for me and that I would need to find my own way back. As I was preparing to leave, Michael arrived at the house, mentioning casually that he had a killer headache after spending the previous night at a bar with old high school friends. The transformation in my parents' attention was immediate and complete. My mother's focus shifted entirely to Michael's condition, pressing him for details about the headache's location and intensity. My father, who moments before had been reluctant to disrupt party preparations for my urgent care visit, was now suggesting they might need to take Michael to the emergency room just to be safe. He was drinking last night, I pointed out, unable to contain my frustration at the obvious disparity. It's probably just a hangover. You never know with head pain, my mother responded seriously. It could be something serious. Remember his migraines in high school? Within minutes, the family mobilization I had observed throughout my life was in full effect. My father calling their primary care physician's personal number, a family friend attending the party later, my mother retrieving prescription migraine medication they kept on hand for Michael, despite his rarely experiencing migraines anymore. Both parents completely focused on his discomfort, while my obviously more severe condition remained peripheral to their concern. Mom, I still need to get to urgent care, I reminded her, as she prepared a cold compress for Michael's forehead. My fever is getting worse. Right. Of course, she responded distractedly. Can you give us a few minutes here? Your father can take you after we get Michael settled. Something about this moment, perhaps the perfect crystallization of the dynamic I had experienced throughout my life, or perhaps simply the physical misery of a serious infection, combined with decades of accumulated frustration, triggered a response unlike any I had allowed myself previously. No, I said firmly, my voice stronger than I expected given how physically awful I felt. I need medical attention now. Michael has a hangover. This is exactly what's been happening our entire lives. My actual medical emergencies are treated as inconveniences while his minor discomforts are family crises. And I'm done accepting it. The room fell silent, my parents and brother staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to confusion. I had never directly challenged the family's medical hierarchy so explicitly before, and the disruption to our established pattern was palpably uncomfortable for everyone. That's not fair, Jessica, my mother finally responded, her tone defensive. Michael has always had more health issues than you. We're just responding appropriately to each situation. No, you're not, I continued, the fever and pain somehow making it easier to articulate frustrations I had suppressed for years. I have a dangerous fever and symptoms of a kidney infection that could lead to sepsis if untreated. Michael has a hangover headache after a night of drinking. There is no rational world in which his condition deserves more urgent attention than mine right now. But that's exactly what's happening, just like it always has. My father attempted to intervene with his characteristic minimization. You're being dramatic. If you're well enough to argue like this, you're probably not as sick as you think. That's exactly the problem, I responded, feeling a curious calm despite the physical discomfort and emotional intensity of the moment. You've been telling me I'm being dramatic about my health my entire life, to the point where I ended up with a ruptured appendix at Christmas 3 years ago because I was conditioned not to complain about severe pain. Meanwhile, Michael mentions a headache after a night of drinking, and you're ready to call his doctor at home and cancel your own birthday party. Michael, to his credit, seemed genuinely surprised by my characterization of our differential treatment. Is that true? About your appendix? He asked, looking genuinely concerned. I didn't realize it had been that serious before we took you to the hospital. It was serious for days before that, I confirmed. I had classic appendicitis symptoms for almost 48 hours before anyone in this family thought it warranted medical attention. And that was only after you were evaluated for indigestion first. The conversation that followed was unlike any our family had ever had about health and care dynamics. For the first time, I refused to accept the familiar dismissals and rationalizations, instead naming specific instances of the double standard I had experienced throughout my life. I described the time I had struggled through a week of bronchitis while maintaining perfect attendance at school, even as Michael stayed home for days with a mild cold. I reminded them of the thousands of dollars spent on specialized allergy testing for Michael's seasonal sniffles, while my debilitating menstrual pain was dismissed as normal and unavoidable. Most importantly, I articulated the long-term impact of this differential treatment, how it had taught me to doubt my own physical experiences, to delay necessary medical care, and to believe at some fundamental level that my suffering was simply less important or worthy of attention than my brother's. And the thing is, I concluded, my voice finally breaking slightly with emotion. This pattern isn't just unfair, it's actually dangerous. I've ended up in emergency situations multiple times because I was taught that seeking help for my pain was somehow selfish or unnecessary. That's not just bad parenting, it's medical neglect. The term medical neglect, clinical and direct, seemed to penetrate my parents' defensive responses in a way that more emotional appeals never had. My father's expression shifted from dismissive frustration to something more complex and uncertain. My mother, always the emotional barometer of our family, looked genuinely shaken by the characterization. It was Michael who ultimately broke the tense silence that followed. "She's right," he said quietly, addressing our parents rather than me. "I've noticed it too, especially in the last few years. You do treat our health issues completely differently." This unexpected alliance, my brother acknowledging and validating my experience, rather than defending the preferential treatment he had received, created a fundamental shift in the family dynamic. My parents could dismiss my perspective as subjective or exaggerated, but Michael's confirmation made the pattern undeniable. "We need to take Jessica to urgent care right now," he continued practically. "I'm fine. I just need water and some regular painkillers. This headache is clearly just from drinking too much last night." What followed was a chaotic but ultimately productive disruption of our long-established family patterns. My father drove me to urgent care, while my mother and Michael managed the final party preparations. I was diagnosed with a severe kidney infection requiring IV antibiotics and monitoring, ultimately spending the night in the hospital while the birthday celebration continued without me. But unlike previous medical episodes, my condition was now the primary family concern, with both parents checking in regularly and Michael coordinating with guests to explain my absence. This moment, my explicit naming of the pattern, Michael's validation of my experience, and the resulting shift in family response, marked the beginning of a significant transformation in how health issues were addressed in our family. The conversation that had begun in crisis continued in the days and weeks that followed, with varying degrees of defensiveness, denial, and eventually, genuine reflection from my parents. "We never meant to make you feel like your health wasn't important," my mother said during a visit to my hospital room the day after the party. "We just saw you as our strong one, the child who could handle things on her own." "But that's the problem," I explained, now able to advocate from a place of greater clarity and confidence. Being strong became an excuse for not giving me the care and attention I needed, and over time, I internalized that so completely that I began neglecting my own health in dangerous ways. These conversations weren't easy or immediately transformative. Decades of established patterns don't dissolve with a single confrontation, no matter how cathartic. My parents alternated between genuine reflection and reflexive returns to old explanations about Michael's special health needs and my supposed resilience. But the pattern had been named explicitly, making it impossible to continue unconsciously as before. In the 3 months since that confrontation, small but significant changes have begun to emerge in our family dynamic. My mother now asks about my health, with the same attentiveness previously reserved exclusively for Michael. My father has acknowledged with obvious difficulty that their differential treatment likely contributed to my delayed care-seeking patterns. Most surprisingly, Michael has become an advocate for more equitable attention, sometimes deliberately deflecting their excessive concern about his minor issues and redirecting the conversation to more substantive health matters. The most meaningful change, however, has occurred in my own relationship with my health and my willingness to advocate for appropriate care. The explicit naming of the family pattern, and having that naming validated by others within the system, has helped liberate me from the deeply internalized belief that my physical suffering is somehow less legitimate or deserving of attention than others. I've established a relationship with a primary care physician who takes my concerns seriously, created clear protocols for addressing health issues promptly, and begun the complex work of trusting my own assessment of my physical needs. Which brings me to today, standing in the doorway of my childhood home, watching my parents frantically pack an overnight bag for my 30-year-old brother, who has called complaining of a headache after a night of drinking. The scene is painfully familiar. The immediate mobilization around Michael's discomfort, the assumption that his pain warrants urgent response, the prioritization of his needs above all else. For a moment, I feel the old frustration rising, the sense that nothing has really changed despite our seemingly transformative confrontation. But then, something unexpected happens. My father, catching my expression as he rushes past with Michael's toiletry bag, suddenly stops. He looks at the bag in his hands, then back at me, a flash of recognition crossing his face. "This is it. Happening again, isn't it?" he says quietly. "What you were talking about before." I nod, not trusting myself to speak, without the old resentment coloring my words. He sets the bag down slowly, as if physically putting down a pattern he's finally able to see. "Michael said it's probably just from drinking too much last night. Maybe we're overreacting." "You think?" I respond, unable to keep the sarcasm completely from my voice despite my best efforts. My mother joins us in the hallway, her expression shifting from confusion to dawning recognition as she observes the scene. "We're doing it again," she says, not a question but a statement of realization. This moment, this real-time recognition of the pattern as it's occurring rather than in retrospect, represents perhaps the most significant evidence of genuine change in our family system. The differential treatment hasn't disappeared entirely, but it's now visible to those perpetuating it, making conscious choice possible where only unconscious repetition existed before. "I'll call Michael back and suggest some over-the-counter pain medication and hydration," my father decides, reaching for his phone instead of the overnight bag. "If he's still feeling bad tomorrow, we can reassess." It's a small moment in the context of decades of entrenched patterns, but it represents something profound, the beginning of a more equitable approach to health concerns in our family, one that acknowledges both Michael's and my needs as equally worthy of appropriate attention. Not excessive attention in either case, but response proportional to the actual medical situation rather than our long-established family roles. When I got sick, they told me not to complain. When my brother sneezed, they called 911. This wasn't just ordinary sibling jealousy or typical parental imperfection. It was a persistent pattern that shaped my relationship with my health in ways that put me at physical risk. The journey to naming and changing this pattern has been neither simple nor complete. But in breaking the silence around our family's medical double standard, I've begun to reclaim not just more appropriate health care, but a deeper sense that my physical experiences and needs matter, both to my family and, most importantly, to myself. This moment of recognition, my father setting down Michael's overnight bag, my mother acknowledging we're doing it again, marked a significant breakthrough in our family's entrenched pattern of medical double standards. But as any therapist will tell you, recognizing a dysfunctional pattern is merely the first step in a much longer journey toward genuine change. The weeks and months that followed would test whether this newfound awareness could translate into consistent behavioral shifts or would simply become another brief, well-intentioned moment, ultimately overwhelmed by decades of established family dynamics. At first, the changes were tentative but noticeable. My parents began making conscious efforts to modulate their responses to Michael's health complaints, sometimes even checking themselves mid-reaction with visible effort. Meanwhile, they showed a new attentiveness to my health updates, asking follow-up questions that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. "How are you feeling after that kidney infection?" my mother asked during a phone call about 2 weeks after the confrontation. "Are you still taking all your antibiotics? Those can be rough on your system." The question itself wasn't remarkable, but the genuine concern in her voice, the same tone she had always used exclusively for Michael's health issues, represented a subtle but meaningful shift. More significant was what happened when I mentioned experiencing some lingering fatigue. "Maybe you should follow up with your doctor," she suggested immediately. "Sometimes infections like that can take longer to clear completely than you'd expect." This recommendation, treating my minor symptom as worthy of medical attention rather than something to simply push through, stood in stark contrast to a lifetime of being told to toughen up about even serious health concerns. The change wasn't lost on me, though I approached it with cautious optimism rather than assuming a permanent transformation had occurred. My father's adaptation followed a different but equally revealing pattern. Less emotionally expressive than my mother, his shift manifested primarily in practical ways, offering to help research specialists when I mentioned a minor but persistent health issue, suggesting I use their insurance for a second opinion on a diagnosis, even adding me to their family health-sharing app so I could access my childhood vaccination records and medical history. "I set up that symptom tracking app on your phone," he announced during my next visit home, reaching for my device with the casual authority parents often maintain long after their children reach adulthood. "It's the same one we've been using for Michael's migraines. Thought it might help you notice patterns with those headaches you mentioned." The equivalence in this gesture, applying to my health the same tools and attention previously reserved exclusively for Michael's, spoke volumes about my father's efforts to correct the imbalance I had named so explicitly. Like my mother's changes, these adjustments weren't perfect or consistent, but they represented genuine attempts to modify patterns so deeply ingrained they had become almost automatic. Michael's response to our family's shifting dynamic proved perhaps the most surprising element of this evolution. Rather than defending the preferential treatment he had received throughout his life, a reaction that would have been understandable given how the system had benefited him, he became an unexpected ally in establishing more equitable patterns of care and concern. "Mom, it's just a regular cold," I overheard him saying during a phone call about a month after our confrontation. "No, you don't need to drive up this weekend to check on me. Remember what Jessica was talking about? This is exactly that thing happening again." This active recognition and redirection represented a level of self-awareness I hadn't anticipated from my brother, who had spent his entire life being the focus of disproportionate medical attention and concern. His willingness to identify and interrupt the pattern, even when it meant receiving less care and attention himself, suggested a genuine understanding of how our family dynamic had affected me and a commitment to more balanced relationships moving forward. These initial changes were encouraging, but inevitably inconsistent. Old patterns would reassert themselves in moments of stress or distraction, with my parents sometimes slipping back into excessive concern about Michael's minor ailments while minimizing my health issues. The difference now was that these lapses were usually recognized, either in the moment or shortly afterward, rather than continuing unacknowledged as they had throughout our earlier lives. "I just realized I've spent 15 minutes asking Michael about his allergies, and haven't even asked how your physical therapy is going," my mother observed during a family video call, catching herself mid-pattern. "Tell me about your shoulder. Is the treatment helping?" These moments of self-correction, while sometimes awkward or forced feeling, demonstrated a growing awareness that was gradually reshaping our family's approach to health concerns. The changes weren't revolutionary or complete, but they represented meaningful evolution in a system that had remained static for decades. The most significant test of this evolving dynamic came approximately 6 months after our initial confrontation, when both Michael and I experienced health issues during the same time period, a scenario that had historically highlighted the disparity in our family's medical attention most dramatically. I had been diagnosed with a herniated disc that required physical therapy and pain management, a condition that developed gradually and required ongoing treatment rather than emergency intervention. Michael, meanwhile, had developed strep throat with a high fever that required antibiotics, but was otherwise straightforward to treat. In our family's previous pattern, his acute but relatively common infection would have commanded all parental attention, while my more complex, but less immediately dramatic condition would have been largely ignored or minimized. What unfolded instead demonstrated both how far we had come and how much further we had to go in truly transforming our family dynamic. My parents initially responded with appropriate concern to Michael's illness, helping him access medical care and ensuring he had necessary medications, a response that was reasonable given his symptoms. The difference emerged in how they simultaneously maintained awareness and support for my ongoing condition, rather than allowing his more acute situation to completely eclipse my needs, as would have happened in the past. "We're going to drive up to check on Michael this weekend," my mother informed me during a phone call. "But we thought we might stop by your place first, if that works for your schedule. We'd like to see how you're managing with your back issues, and if there's anything you need help with at home while you're dealing with limited mobility." This balanced attention, addressing both our health needs appropriately, rather than creating a hierarchy where only one of us could receive care and concern at a time, represented significant progress in our family's approach. It wasn't perfect equivalence, and traces of the old pattern remained visible in subtle ways, but the conscious effort to maintain awareness of both our medical situations simultaneously was unprecedented in our family history. What proved most revealing, however, was a conversation I overheard between my parents while they were visiting my apartment that weekend. Thinking I was still in the bedroom changing after my physical therapy session, they spoke candidly in my kitchen. Unaware I could hear their exchange. "Do you think we're doing enough for Jessica's back situation?" my father asked, his voice carrying the genuine concern I had rarely heard directed toward my health issues. "The physical therapy seems helpful, but I wonder if we should help her get a consultation with that spine specialist we took Michael to last year for his sports injury." "I was thinking the same thing," my mother responded. "This seems more serious than she's letting on. I'm worried she's still downplaying her symptoms because of how we've responded in the past. We really messed up with that, didn't we?" my father said after a brief silence, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. All those years of treating their health issues so differently. Jessica was right about everything she said. "I keep thinking about that appendicitis episode," my mother continued, her voice tight with what sounded like suppressed emotion. "She could have died because we taught her that her pain didn't matter as much as Michael's. How do we even begin to make that right?" This unguarded exchange, expressing genuine regret and responsibility rather than defensive justification, affected me more deeply than any of their more deliberate efforts at changed behavior. It suggested that beyond the visible adjustments they had been making in their responses to our health issues, a more fundamental reevaluation was occurring in how they understood their parenting history and its impact on both their children. When I finally entered the kitchen, both looked slightly startled, making me wonder if they suspected I might have overheard their conversation. Rather than acknowledging it directly, I simply accepted their offer to help arrange a consultation with the spine specialist, recognizing this suggestion as part of their attempt to correct the imbalance in medical support that had characterized our family for so long. The following months brought continued evolution in our family's approach to health concerns, though not without occasional regressions into established patterns. My parents sometimes still overreacted to Michael's minor ailments or needed reminders to take my health issues seriously. The difference was that these lapses were now generally recognized and corrected, rather than perpetuated unconsciously as before. Perhaps the most meaningful indicator of genuine change came from an unexpected source: my brother, who had been the primary beneficiary of our family's medical attention imbalance throughout childhood and early adulthood. During a rare private conversation when we found ourselves alone during a family gathering, he broached the subject that had remained somewhat awkward between us, despite the changes occurring in our broader family dynamic. "I want you to know I've been doing a lot of thinking about everything you said that day," he began awkwardly, referring to my confrontation about our family's medical double standard, about how differently Mom and Dad treated our health stuff growing up. I nodded, unsure where he was heading with this introduction. "The thing is," he continued, "I don't think I fully realized it was happening, even though I was right in the middle of it. It just seemed normal that they were super attentive to my health because that's all I ever knew. But looking back now, seeing how they'd drop everything for my minor issues while you were pushed to keep going through serious stuff, it's really messed up." This acknowledgement, from the person who had benefited most from the imbalance, carried a particular weight that even my parents' efforts at change hadn't achieved. Michael hadn't just been a passive recipient of preferential treatment, but had now become an active participant in recognizing and naming the unfairness of that system. "I've been trying to figure out if there was something I could have done differently," he added, genuine remorse evident in his expression. "If I should have noticed or said something when we were younger." "You were just a kid," I reminded him. "We both were. Neither of us created that dynamic. It was established before we were old enough to recognize it, let alone challenge it. Still," he insisted, "I'm sorry. Not just for not noticing, but for all the times I probably made it worse by accepting all that attention as normal or deserved. And I want you to know, I'm trying to be more aware of it now, both with Mom and Dad, and in how I think about my own health stuff compared to other people's." This conversation marked a significant evolution in my relationship with Michael. A shift from the unconscious competition for medical attention that had characterized our childhood to a more balanced adult relationship where both of us could acknowledge the dysfunctional system we had been raised in and its different impacts on our development. One of the more unexpected outcomes of our family's reckoning with its medical double standard was how it created space to recognize and address other areas where similar patterns of differential treatment had shaped our experiences. The medical disparity had been the most dramatic and potentially dangerous manifestation of unequal attention, but once that pattern became visible, others began to emerge from the background of our family history. "I think we did this with school stuff too," my father observed during a family dinner about 8 months after our initial confrontation. "We made such a big deal about Michael's B+ in math that one semester, but I don't remember ever really acknowledging Jessica's consistent straight A's. Or activities," my mother added, building on his observation. "We never missed one of Michael's baseball games, but I know we skipped several of Jessica's debate competitions because they conflicted with other commitments. These recognitions, extending beyond the specific issue of medical attention to broader patterns of differential investment and acknowledgement, suggested a deeper transformation in how my parents understood their parenting history. Rather than defending individual instances of unequal treatment, they were beginning to identify the systemic nature of the disparity that had shaped both their children's experiences in fundamentally different ways. For my part, this expanding awareness helped contextualize aspects of my personality and coping mechanisms that had developed in response to our family dynamic. My extreme self-reliance, discomfort with seeking help, and tendency to minimize my own achievements or needs, traits I had always attributed simply to my natural temperament, now appeared more clearly as adaptations to a family system where attention and care were unequally distributed. I think I became super independent because I had to be, I reflected during a therapy session, focused on these realizations. When you learn early that your needs aren't going to receive the same attention as someone else's, you either fight constantly for recognition, or you adapt by needing less, or at least appearing to need less. I chose the second path. This insight, connecting my adult patterns of self-reliance and difficulty accepting help to my childhood experiences of differential treatment, opened new avenues for personal growth beyond just healthier medical self-advocacy. I began examining other areas where I might be unnecessarily limiting myself by maintaining adaptations that had once been necessary for family functioning, but were now potentially self-restricting. Approximately 1 year after the confrontation that had disrupted our family's entrenched patterns, a situation arose that demonstrated both how far we had come and the ongoing nature of our collective healing process. I was diagnosed with a condition requiring minor surgery, nothing life-threatening but significant enough to warrant genuine medical attention and a recovery period of several weeks. In our family's previous dynamic, this situation would have received minimal acknowledgement or support, particularly if it coincided with any health concern of Michael's, however minor. What unfolded instead reflected the gradual but meaningful transformation in our family system. My parents responded with appropriate concern and practical support, offering to travel to my city for the procedure and stay to help during the initial recovery period. Michael rearranged his work schedule to visit briefly during my hospital stay, bringing thoughtfully selected comfort items rather than the hastily purchased generic gifts that might have characterized previous efforts. Most tellingly, when my father developed a minor respiratory infection during his stay at my apartment, the family's attention remained appropriately balanced rather than immediately shifting entirely to his condition, as would have happened in the past. My mother helped him access necessary medication and rest, while continuing to provide the post-surgical support I needed. The situation was handled without drama or explicit discussion of the balance being maintained. It had simply become a more natural way of functioning, rather than requiring constant conscious correction. This incident, managing both my surgery and my father's minor illness with appropriate attention to each, perhaps best exemplifies the nature of our family's evolution. The change hasn't been revolutionary or complete. Traces of the old patterns sometimes still emerge in subtle ways. But the consistent recognition of these patterns when they do appear, coupled with genuine efforts to establish more equitable approaches to care and attention, has created a family dynamic that bears little resemblance to the system that once taught me my pain didn't matter. Today, 2 years after the confrontation that catalyzed these changes, I maintain a relationship with my family that is simultaneously closer and healthier than what existed before. The honesty that began with naming the medical double standard has extended to other aspects of our interactions, creating space for more authentic connection that acknowledges both the failures of the past and the ongoing efforts to establish healthier patterns. My relationship with my own health has transformed most dramatically of all. At 31, I have finally developed the capacity to recognize and respond appropriately to my physical needs without the excessive self-doubt and minimization that once characterized my approach to medical care. I no longer wait until situations become emergencies before seeking help, and I've established relationships with healthcare providers who take my concerns seriously and provide the care I need without requiring the drama of crisis to justify attention. This journey, from a child who learned to suppress expressions of pain to an adult capable of appropriate medical self-advocacy, hasn't been linear or simple. There have been setbacks, moments when old patterns reasserted themselves in my own behavior, or my family's responses. The difference now is that these regressions are recognized and addressed, rather than perpetuated unconsciously. creating opportunity for continued growth and healing. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of this transformation has been the recognition that our family's medical double standard wasn't unique or isolated, but reflected broader social patterns in how pain and illness are perceived and addressed across gender lines. Research consistently shows that women's pain is taken less seriously than men's in medical settings, that women wait longer for appropriate treatment in emergency departments, and that their symptoms are more likely to be attributed to psychological rather than physical causes. Understanding my experience within this wider context has helped depersonalize aspects of the family dynamic that once felt deeply and specifically hurtful. My parents didn't invent the tendency to view male suffering as more legitimate or deserving of attention than female pain. They simply enacted cultural patterns that permeate medical care and family systems more broadly. This recognition doesn't excuse the disparity I experienced, but helps explain how well-intentioned parents could perpetuate such harmful double standards without conscious awareness or malicious intent. This broader perspective has also informed how I discuss these issues with others, particularly young women who may be experiencing similar patterns of medical minimization within their own families or healthcare interactions. The story of our family's journey, from entrenched inequality to growing awareness and change, offers both validation for those experiencing medical dismissal and hope that such patterns can be named, challenged, and ultimately transformed. When I got sick, they told me not to complain. When my brother sneezed, they called 911. This differential treatment wasn't just unfair, it was potentially dangerous, teaching me to doubt my own physical experiences and delay necessary care in ways that put my health at serious risk. But in naming this pattern explicitly, in refusing to accept the familiar rationalizations that had maintained it for decades, I created space for a different kind of family relationship, one based on more equitable care and genuine recognition of each person's needs. The transformation remains imperfect and ongoing. Old patterns sometimes resurface, particularly in moments of stress or crisis, when unconscious responses tend to override more deliberate choices. But the awareness that now exists within our family system makes these regressions visible rather than automatic, creating opportunity for correction and continued growth rather than perpetuation of harmful dynamics. For anyone experiencing similar patterns of medical dismissal or differential treatment within their family systems, I offer this perspective. The dynamics that shape how our pain and illness are perceived and addressed are often deeply rooted in family histories and broader cultural patterns that long preceded our individual experiences. Naming these patterns explicitly, while difficult and potentially disruptive to established family functioning, creates possibility for transformative change that benefits not just the person whose needs have been minimized, but ultimately the entire family system. My journey from medical self-neglect to appropriate self-advocacy remains ongoing, with continued growth and occasional setbacks. But the foundation has been established for a healthier relationship with both my physical well-being and my family connections, one where my pain matters as much as anyone else's, where seeking appropriate care is recognized as necessary rather than self-indulgent, and where the family system that once taught me to minimize my suffering now acknowledges the legitimacy of all its members' needs with growing equity and awareness.